but he spent an important part of his career in Manitoba, where he was mayor of Winnipeg, and also was president of the Big Mayors. He, now in honor of that part of his life, we've got Gerald Farley here representing Manitoba, Carolyn Butler, so we wanted to cover aspects of Glen's life through our program today. And part of it we just discovered serendipitously this morning, because in addition to attending Concordia University, he also spent a year at what was then called the University College of Cape Breton, and we have the president of Cape Breton University here too, so we can comprehend different aspects of Glen's life. There he spent a lot of time looking at the co-op movement. But I got to know Glen through the National Roundtable, which, as Pam mentioned, was the organization that founded and started LSF in 1991. Glen was appointed chair of the National Roundtable. I was a member at the time, and I was so impressed with his leadership skills, with his capacity to look at the big picture and to get the work of the Roundtable focused on very important issues. Issues that are so important that the Roundtable has now dissolved. But that's a different story, which we won't go into at this point. He moved to Toronto in 2004. He entered provincial politics and was elected in 2010. His first ministry appointment was Minister of Infrastructure, and then Innovation, then Minister of Transportation, and now at his current appointment as Minister of Environment and Climate Change. He has served in a number of other capacities, including with the Toronto District School Board's reference group for improving services for marginalized students. So Glen comes to us with a passionate commitment to sustainability in its fullest sense, in terms of the integration of the environment, social dimensions, business and the economy, and is an ideal person to lead us this morning with that keynote address. Glen.
Thank you, David. I feel like it's still home week here. It is. It's sort of. I feel like I'm watching my life in slices, flashing back. I was joking with David Wheeler. I saw the Cape Breton Follies, the Rise and Follies of Cape Breton, which is something never to be missed, and it's still going on. But I actually lived one of the skits I saw there. The skit goes something like this. And when I was living in Glace Bay, you stand at a bus stop and someone comes up to you, and when you have a name like mine and you're in Cape Breton, there's all kinds of assumptions that are made, and no one ever asks you where they're from, which would be a very simple process. That's like, are you from, Big Pond or something? And it goes something like this. So what's your name? My name's Glen Murray. Oh! Are you related to Elspeth Murray from Big Pond? No. Are you related to Arnold Murray from Shediac? And this goes on. Fortunately, there's a lot of head time between buses in Cape Breton, because you have to go through 20 rounds of this before someone finally comes to the conclusion, and the conversation always seems to end like this. You're not from around here, are you? And when you've lived in places like Winnipeg and Cape Breton, there's a sense, we were talking about that, of social enterprise and culture that's extraordinarily powerful. And David and I were talking about how it enables change. The familiarity and the sense of closeness really allows an incredible amount of innovation and creativity. And when you live in a very large city like Toronto, that kind of loose relationships and tight relationships are harder to create. And sometimes many good things don't happen because of the complexity and distance between people. And it's a somewhat remarkable thing when you can create organizations like this that actually create both those tight and loose relationships amongst vast numbers of people that are so important to enabling change. I also just want to give a shout out to my friend Donna Cansfield, who's here, who I miss terribly, one of the best MPPs we ever had in the legislature, and someone who was extraordinary at connecting the dots between energy, the economy, conservation, and unrelentingly campaign for those. And I as a relatively new MPP at the time, I now have great reverence for her patience, because my chief of staff reminds me of all our conversations start with the following prefix. Minister, you have to understand, politics is like the slow boring of hard wood. Change does not come quickly. And I try not to be slow or boring, and generally difficult. So this is not a culture that I am comfortable working in all the time. As David and I share that kind of impatience for change. And so what I want to talk about, I'd like to actually have just sort of a conversation, if we can, if that's all right. But I want to talk about something that I've been wanting to learn about and sort of share my very crude and not terribly informed views on with you, because I think you're an interesting group looking at issues, and climate change would be the one that I'm most concerned with. But there was a quote in this wonderful document which you have on your table, which you made for old people, almost impossible to read. But it's smaller than newspaper type, and it's white on a green background, graphically lovely. But for those of us who are visually challenged, a challenge. But if you just pick a few, it's this lovely picture. You should open it up. It's a great little, someone wants to borrow for it. It's a lovely piece. But there's a quote there that caught my eye because it touched me, given the experiences that I've had. It's a quote from Ian Pettigrew, the Director of Curriculum and Assessment at the Ontario Teachers Federation. And he's quoted as saying, "Connecting the dots, your wonderful, wonderful education program, inspires hope and promise, antidotes to despondency and despair, and underscores a sense of purposeful agency for students and educators alike in their ongoing quest to be the architects of a better present future, both locally and globally." And as I was reading that, I sort of said, that really is our mission in life right now. And it also sort of, I think, speaks to the complexity and challenge we have, because there's a problem I've had. As a matter of fact, when David and I were at the National Roundtable, the CEO at the time was Gene Nyberg, and I'll never forget one coffee we had when we talked about despair. Gene pulled me aside and he said, I said, "So Gene, what do you really think about climate change? What's the prospects here?" And he looked at me and said, "Glenn, it's probably too late. We probably have 5 years to get this right." It's 2004. We're running out of time, and I am in a rather deep state of despair about this. And I plan on retiring soon to go off and work with my horses and love my grandchildren and take care of my family. And I'll never forget that conversation, because I was new, and I went home and I said, "Well, that was heavy. Jeez." Flash forward 5 years later, when David and I think, finished our terms, and I had been working under Prime Minister Harper at that time. For some reason, they didn't fire me right away, which was sort of, yeah. And then they started dismantling all of the programs. The Major Climate Change Fund went out, $6 billion gone. Much of what was happening with NRSA, scientists started disappearing in large numbers, and then the National Roundtable eventually, after the great work that Bob Page did on it, my successor, who's a remarkable guy on a working group from Alberta. We have an Albertan on a working group who lives in Calgary, who is working with me. All of that work and all of that knowledge, and most importantly, talking about culture and relationship, it built a culture between business and government that really hadn't existed in any other area. People like Steve Williams of Suncor, and David and I were co-authoring policy papers together. This is the president, now the president of Suncor. So I mean, it was really transformative in the sense that it didn't try to create some sort of bureaucratic process. It just aligned people who had to make decisions together and help them facilitate policy, but we also influenced the way that each of us worked. And that is so critical because you cannot have some sort of puff of smoke come out of Queen's Park or the Peace Tower and we're going to have the answer to climate change. It's not about regulations. It's about setting very aggressive, aspirational goals, holding each other accountable for meeting them, and having innovation-driven productivity to improve our carbon productivity, to up the innovation and productivity of our economy so that we can actually get down from 2.5 planets to well within 1 planet and start using our carbon, making it so productive that we need so little of it because we're getting so much out of it. And the countries that are successfully reducing their greenhouse gas emissions are the ones that have detached their GDP growth from their per capita consumption growth, from their energy growth, and from literally at the end of that, their carbon growth. and very high-paid consultants, my friends like Roger Martin and Kevin Lynch, talk about this idea of Canada's productivity challenge, that we have this gap in productivity with the United States, that if we simply could close that, all of us, each Ontarian would have the equivalent of about $7,500 more disposable income, because we would create greater value of labor and greater value of our economy. So when you actually look at the great work that organizations are doing, like Sustainable Prosperity, they're looking at this idea of carbon productivity and restoring the biocapacity of our ecological services. So you try to rebuild all the things that Mother Nature does for it, restore that, and you try to use less carbon to do that. And it's quite remarkable. I mean, it's basically as simple as an electric vehicle that doesn't run on fossil fuels, so that you use fossil fuels for those very specific things for which there is not a substitute, which is interesting because much of everything from green technology to some medical devices, we don't have substitutes for the derivatives of different fossil fuel products. We're going to run out of them, and we need them for a lot of the things we're facing. But it's a cultural shift. Because when you actually look at trying to motivate people to do that, why would we want to do that now? Well, going back to my conversation with Gene Nyberg, because I was always inspired by the enterprise of a low-carbon economy. But I couldn't find out why no one else seemed to be as motivated. And when the Premier Wynne asked me to take this job on, I wasn't happy about it, to be quite honest. I was Cleopatra, Queen of Denial. I had comfortably left the round table, forgot those conversations with Gene Nyberg, and was really having a great time integrating land use planning and electrifying the GO system and trying to get trains to run on every 15 minutes on time with zero emissions. I thought this was a little world. I understood. I liked electric choo-choo trains. I'm a complete urban policy geek and wonk, as Donna would tell you. And I was in my element. It was the job I always wanted. And I didn't want to deal with the complexity of this. I didn't have a lot of faith that government or there was the culture in our society to make the changes we need to, and that the disinformation on climate change was epic and dwarfed even the efforts by tobacco companies to extinguish any intelligent scientific conversation around tobacco. I mean, we're full on. And who would want to do this? And it was very hard. It took me, the hardest part of doing this job was actually getting into an emotional set. I lost 100 pounds, I quit and gave up my car, I ride to work today, I totally changed my life and I'm continuing to. And I said, if I'm going to do this and I have to take care of myself, I have to have my own little garden to play in, that no matter what's going on in the world out there, and you talked about that, when you can't find hope globally, create it locally, right? That's sort of one of the messages here, which I think is important to the psychological survival. So I'm now getting into a community garden. I am now close to living a pretty carbon neutral lifestyle. I even got the Ontario government into an offsets program, which has never been in before it started. We're now in the process of formalizing that. But I have to get my entire life aligned with my values and prove that I could live myself on this planet within the opportunities and constraints. That if I could become a net zero individual, which I'm pretty close to right now, that would be fun. Well, what do you say to kids? I have a 5-year-old grandson. So and I would say to people, if you don't want to, before I even do anything, if you haven't Googled 4 degrees Celsius mean temperature change, we can't have a conversation. I'm not even interested, really, quite frankly, in talking to people who are not so concerned as citizens to even go through that. You all have Google. You know what I mean? I found out with the sex ed stuff so hysterically funny. It's like we're teaching kids who are 8 years old about body parts and things that they do. I said, every kid knows what a bad word is. And every child I know knows how to take that word, put it in a Google search, and frighteningly hit the video option. You can see graphic BDSM, and you don't have to. There's no review or card that comes up. We're living in a world where we seem to be not concerned about the exploitative, sexist, horribly violent stuff that there is no barrier to. We have the film rating agency. I mean, I just try to imagine that they rated, your entire laptop would be adult restricted, So we live in this world where we're trying to protect ourselves from information, and that's often driven by fear and a lack of understanding of reality in all kinds of dimensions. And the same is true with climate change. 4 degrees Celsius will tell you it's in major extinction event. We can't likely, as a species, survive at 4 degrees or 5 degrees. And the other problem we have in the science, and I say this as not a scientist, but as a layperson who spent 20 years hanging out with people like David Bell Gene Nyberg and others, and really good teachers and mentors. And there's a lot of you that will please object if you think I've got this wrong, but I'm fairly fearless that won't be the case. I mean, when you actually look at it, we have a problem because we now have biospheric destruction. So for most of our discussions about climate change up to this point, the planet was our friend. It helped us. Our boreal forest, our, absorbed carbon and that. Our big cold oceans kept the lid on climate change. The rainforest, like the Amazon rainforest, was a huge carbon sink. So no matter how much we screwed things up and emitted carbon as human beings, Mother Nature had this incredible capacity to absorb our excesses. Now we have some problems. The rainforest now, the Amazon rainforest, absorbs only half as much carbon dioxide as it did when I was born. That's 50% loss. We've emitted a lot more carbon than we did in 1957. The oceans. I learned how to scuba dive. This is part of this personal journey that I was on. Another thing, I said, okay, so what else do I have to understand in my own life? How do I change? I said, well, I look fabulous in spandex from head to toe. So my public needs to see me in that. So I went down and I learned how to scuba dive. And I did that because I had been reading about ocean acidification, and I had been reading about warming of our oceans, and I was reading about their impact on reefs. So I'm down there, and I had my first week. I was terrified. I have fear of heights, so I have two bucket things. I want to jump out of a perfectly good airplane, and I'm really afraid of drowning. So being 60 feet underwater, when the instructor said to me, so now you take your mask off and take your regulator and throw it away. You have to keep breathing. They say, don't ever stop breathing. Pretty hard to do when you've got no face mask and no regulator, and then put it all back on. And you do this in shallow water, which I screwed up 4 times before the 5th time we got it right. And I said, this is the one thing I can't screw up on the first try, right? And I just I did it, and the price for working through those fears, moving out of my, I wouldn't even say it comfort zone, it was into the horror zone. Like I'd rather watch slasher movies than do that. And I hate those things. I can't sleep for days after. But then, that led to a journey that I never thought, because I met a woman named Doris, about 7, 8 years old, former oceanographer from Woods Hole, brilliant scientist, and she said, show me your dive map. So she said, and hers, which was about 5 years older than mine, had a whole lot more flags on it than mine did. When the little dive flag, which are the dive sites you go, right? They recommended them. And I said, why does yours have so many flags? He said, well, let's go to some of these places that they no longer recommend you go to. So she was very experienced. She's retired down there. She's not leaving. Her whole life is about reefs. So she said, 25% of our reefs are dead. Great Barrier Reef, this was the Mesoamerican reef that I was in. And this was my 5th dive. So she said, they have a really smart thing in these are very poor countries. So their way that they manage species counts is they give all the tourists who are divers down there a little colored card that you take with you, a little underwater felt marker, and you count all the fish when you're diving. And they ask you to do that every 5th dive. And most people do it because it's kind of exciting, and then that becomes a database. So we did that. We did that in one really lush area. Then we waited our 2 hours, and then we went back, and she took me to some of the areas that were dead. It is the most morbid, awful, grim environment I've ever seen. So you go on these healthy reefs, which are exploding with life and the renewal of life, and there's a vibrancy and an energy, and it's like every time you turn around, you see a turtle or some extraordinary, colorful school of fish, and microcosms of little tiny creatures that the experts show you. And then we went off to the edge of the Mesoamerican reef, where the water changed and the acid levels were marginally different. We got marginal difference in acid levels, and the reef was dead. And you get a sense of horror. I can't describe it in any other way when she told me, well, 40% of what the remaining part that you're looking at within the next few decades probably will look much like this. So what's happening now is our oceans, which are one of our big carbon sinks, are no longer functioning that. We're getting to a saturation point. And I remember my friend Gene Nyberg saying, watch the oceans and watch the birds and bees. When you see the pollinators start to go, and you start to see the oceans not absorbing carbon dioxide anymore, we're getting to some points of no return. So you better start acting sooner than that. And so we have from CO2 not just climate change, but ocean acidification. And so we're now we're now moving past trigger points, and we have to avoid tipping points. Because you can't really, we have good universities, but we haven't taught anyone else how to rebuild a reef from scratch in an ocean that's a little too warm and a little too acidic. You know, I don't think there's an advanced PhD yet on rebuilding Mother Nature. So this is our legacy to our children. And this is the cultural challenge, to go back to what I wanted to talk to you about, which is how do you talk about these things? It is the biggest challenge for parents, for grandparents, for educators. I mean, kids are going to be really angry at us. You know? Can we do this? Yes, we can. I mean, but to me, we have to go to a war footing. I mean, I'm on a campaign to treat things like it's 1939, when Canada didn't have a navy. And by 1942, we took on the most brutal military threat, and we won. And in 3 years, we built the largest navy, third largest navy in the world. You know, you go drive to Montreal, you'll see all of those tank and ship factories still sitting there empty. But it is that kind of thing that we need to do. The low-carbon economy will be a $6 trillion expansion of our economy. 6 times what the tech boom was in the 90s. You remember the day before your 8-year-old had a laptop and taught, you know, grandma how to use the BlackBerry and that kind of stuff. We're still working on Jim Bradley, by the way, not working well. You know. It's a colleague of ours who's the longest serving member of the legislature who has a whiteberry. He refuses to give in. It's a white notepad in which he has got micro perfect handwriting. I'm very envious. But that's the way we are. Like, it's this culture change that we have to. How do you have a conversation with kids? Like, so, you know, I look at food share in my neighborhood. I look at the Eco Schools project, or the amazing work you're doing, which I really think is so critical. But how do we get back to our friend Ian Pettigrew's sense of hope? How do we create the sense of mission and possibility in children? How do we locally in our schools and our lives and our neighborhoods skill our children and emotionally equip them with the ability to lead and manage change? You know, when a war came along, people signed up in the First World War, the Second World War, they just got recruited, and they got put on planes and ships and got sent into the worst situations, and millions of people died. I mean, there was no preparation for that. This is what James Howard Kunstler calls the long, slow emergency. It's coming at us in drips and drags, decade by decade. We're now living with the consequences of the carbon dioxide levels that were in the atmosphere when I was in elementary school. And, you know, in 1972, 57 years from now, if this was the midpoint of my life, we'll be living with the results of 400 parts, right? And that we know is much more catastrophic. That blows us past 2 degrees Celsius. So we need a sense of urgent, transformative leadership, and we need education to bring hope, pragmatism, emotionally prepare our children for, you know, we are the last generation that will know normal climate. Our children are the first that will never know normal climate. And that is going to be the events like in 2012 when we lost 80% of our apple crop and couldn't grow food. It is going to be food and water first. California, 3 years of extreme drought. NASA just projected 40 years of extreme drought. And what was the reaction of the US Senate? They just canceled $1.7 billion, the entire NASA budget for the Earth Sciences program. They're only interested in off-planet research. What a stupid time to do that. We're now going to eviscerate all of the research, all of the data, all of the measurements we have about what's happening on our planet by the most sophisticated group of scientists, environmentalists in the world. Senator Hawking, the guy who threw the snowball down, has now effectively eviscerated that. This is how crazy it is for our kids. So we've got to get our kids to be skilled politicians. We've got to get our kids to be skilled advocates as well as scientists. And to me, that's the mission. How do we shift our culture? How do we change the assumptions? How do we bring science into the discourse? How do we call to account those leaders that want to not just ignore science, but eviscerate our society's capacity to create knowledge and evidence and inform public policy? That's how serious this is. There is nothing more important we will do in our lives. And as educators and friends of education and a healthy culture, you are doing the most important work that anyone could do. You are more important than the great generation and they'll have the most sober and important mission in history. Because if we get this wrong, this is the end of history for us as a species. It is that serious. And if you read The Sixth Extinction, there's so much popular literature out by intelligent, informed scientists that confirms those things. So how do we manage a culture change? And I don't think anyone can do it better than educators. So I need your help. And I hope you'll have brilliant insights and some tough questions, and we can have a little conversation, and then I got to go to Hamilton. But thank you very much.
How about questions?
Absolutely. That's what I said. We'll have a little conversation.
Okay.
Questions.
Glenn has said that he would take questions and want to have a conversation with us. So
Yeah, or hear views of some smart people.